in your home. And so, as I just mentioned, there are so many different sources of lead in the water that can end up in these bottles. In the Michigan lead and copper rule, right now, we take the first liter sample out of the tap and the 5th liter sample. In Michigan, we revised the lead and copper rule back in 2018. We used to only do the first liter water. That meant all of our compliance data was only from our faucets and the household plumbing, never from a lead service line. So the first lead action level exceedance in Benton Harbor was based on first liter samples only, just from faucets, no lead service lines. Then after that, in the next round of sampling, we changed the samples so we're collecting both the first and the 5th liter of samples. That 5th liter of water is more likely to come directly from a lead pipe. So here is our compliance sampling data. So this is going back to 2011. And so you can see here, we've got the first lead action level exceedance. I think that was 22 parts per billion. And in 2019, we changed the sampling protocol to start collecting water from lead service lines. So we've had elevated lead in Benton Harbor for 6 consecutive compliance sampling periods. That's the longest period of consecutive lead action level exceedances in the state of Michigan. So that was another reason why we're filed the petition, because this is unacceptable. No community should ever have to deal with this. So that is how we measure compliance with the lead and copper rule. We take the 90th percentile of sample results. But the second graph here is with has the maximum lead detected in our compliance samples. So you'll notice this axis here goes up to 1,000 parts per billion. Wow. And our samples collected in June 2021 were as high as 900 parts per billion. Again, the safe level of lead in drinking water is 0. In our most recent compliance sampling period, lead levels were coming down. So this was data collected through December of 2021, and so the 90th percentile result was 15 parts per billion. So we're getting better, but that doesn't tell the whole story about lead in the water, especially when we have lead pipes. So this is a set of sample results I collected here in Benton Harbor back in November, and this is taking all of those liters when I line up those sample bottles on the countertop and collect all of that. And so if you look at this site, we have our first and 5th liter. They are both right around 10 parts per billion here at this house. But we found this pattern that after the 5th liter, we found higher levels of lead. In fact, levels high above that lead action level of 15 parts per billion. And so this was a limited data set at a few sites like this that I collected, but EPA did sequential sampling in Benton Harbor, and the majority of homes where they collect sequential samples, they found the same pattern, where they found even higher levels of lead past the 5th liter sample. Wow. So I know there have been some sampling programs available here for residents to either participate in compliance sampling or do voluntary sampling on your own. And everything I've seen is that you collect the first liter of water for those samples. Majority of those sample results are very low. And that's because of the same thing here. We're just collecting that first liter of water, oftentimes just through a faucet which has lower levels of lead in it than a solid lead pipe that would be your lead service line. So beware, when you see lead results, you need to know how the samples were collected. You need to know if there's a lead service line. We should always be assuming that there was a risk of lead in the water, especially when we know there's a lead or galvanized service line at the home. Yeah, so their arrow is pointing at the very high lead levels at the original home. Okay, so the takeaway here is compliance samples are not telling the whole story. We need to always take precautions to make sure we're not drinking lead in the water. So now I want to move away from lead a little bit because we got more information about the water quality in Benton Harbor after we filed the petition in September. Let's see, Eagle and EPA did an inspection of the water treatment plant in September, and EPA issued a unilateral administrative order in November that raise many, many issues in the water treatment plant, many of which have been identified going back to 2018 in different plant inspections that have happened in Benton Harbor. This was all news to us because the lead data is made publicly available on the Eagle website. All this other data is not readily available to the public. So, it is some complicated information, so I've got a few diagrams to kind of work through it to explain what's happening. It was interesting to have this call that Reverend Hinckley talked about yesterday, because I'm pretty sure the technical presentation we saw was probably the first time some of these high-level administrators had ever heard this stuff about how water treatment plants work. So, this is a diagram of a conventional surface water treatment plant. Benton Harbor gets its water from Lake Michigan. We have a lot of stuff that can be in our source water. We can have chemicals, we can have contaminants, we can have microorganisms. There are tons of microorganisms. Some are naturally occurring and don't cause disease, and some of them can be harmful. We have all sorts of them in our source water quality. And so we have treatment plants with multiple levels of treatment to remove those, and there's redundancies and safety factors. Because there are so many potential contaminants in source water, or our surface water treatment rules, we focus on monitoring the treatment process rather than individual contaminants themselves. So we have to make sure that the filters are working. We have to make sure that there's the right dose of chlorine and for the right duration of time in the water treatment plant. So when we talk about data at the water treatment plant, we often don't have contaminant data. And what we saw in the EPA unilateral administrative order is that many of these monitoring devices in the water treatment plant weren't working. So typically, we have these monitors throughout here. And so I'm going to pivot to talking about what we know about the Benton Harbor water treatment plant. So we've got monitors that should be working. We read that there may be some that are not through. And so one of the first things that they have identified in their report is that the Benton Harbor water treatment plant changed their initial point of disinfection where they add chlorine to the water. They changed it back in 2017. And that is interesting because if you do that, you are required to do a study and before you change your point of disinfection. And that failure to do that study is a violation. So the first violation here, there was a study required, it did not happen, it was back in 2017. That's a long time ago. So then in this EPA unilateral administrative order, it said many of the devices that are monitoring in the treatment plant have been out of service, they haven't been calibrated, they haven't been updated, nobody's maintaining these. So that tells me, how can we know if we're meeting the minimum requirements of water treatment if the devices that we rely on in the surface water treatment rule are not operating? Amen. So then they had a new inspection in February. They wrote a new report, and what they found here is that they thought that disinfection was being added prior to their finished water storage reservoirs, which this is important because it affects that calculation of how much chlorine is in the water and how long is it there. Come on. They thought it was here. Turns out it's actually here. So all of the calculations that they ever had from this location have always been wrong. Yeah, it's wrong. So at this meeting yesterday, they were presenting data. They did some estimations of what might be happening there, but they don't have the actual data because what they thought was happening wasn't actually happening. And I'll use EPA's own words here from that report. The data collected through February 2022 does not represent the treatment process. So that is concerning. There are public notice requirements associated with these violations. They have not yet gone out to the public. They should have started back in 2017. Exactly. There is no public information. There is no information available to the community about these issues going on with the water treatment plant.
Come on.
All of the public outreach is only about lead. And that's a problem, because we need to have transparent information, we need to know what's going on with our water quality, we need to know if it's safe for our families and our children to drink. So then, I'm just gonna move next to the next step with the filter study, because there's this effort to pass out water filters. We have filters that are certified for lead removal. They are great for lead removal. They are only certified for lead removal. They do not address microbial contaminants.
Come on now.
The filter cartridges, they are carbon-based, and they remove the lead. They're great. They're a very important intervention for removing lead from water when lead is the only contaminant that we're concerned about.
Come on.
But the carbon can allow, if there's microorganisms in the water, can allow microorganisms to grow. So this is why we have been very concerned about these findings at the water treatment plant. We don't have enough information. We don't know if there's microorganisms breaking through. We want more information before they say that filters are the way to go in Benton Harbor.
No, they ain't.
Told me it was putting the cart before the horse.
And so that's why, out of an abundance of caution, we have been pushing the bottled water, because we know that that is not creating that additional risk. So it is very important to know that the filters are great for reducing lead, but they don't do anything for our microbial contaminants.
Come on now.
So in our petition, we asked EPA to complete a filter study, and that's great. And they have found through their data collection that the filters in Benton Harbor quality water for reducing lead are working. But one thing that they haven't really put clearly on their website that I do want to point out for you, their filters are great intervention when we're meeting all of our all the treatment requirements at the water treatment plant. But there is a difference between faucet mount filters and pitcher filters, and it's demonstrated through the EPA's data. They have not made these conclusions very clear to the public, but a faucet mount filter that goes directly onto the faucet in your kitchen sink, those very consistently bring lead levels down to non-detectable levels. A pitcher filter consistently brings the water down to below 5 parts per billion. The filters are certified at 5 parts per billion, so they both meet the same certification standards, but the faucet mounts are more effective for getting the lead levels lower. So we want to wait to use those till we know that the water treatment plant is in compliance, but then be aware of those differences in performance. So this is kind of wrapping it all together here. Use your lead reducing filters when the water treatment plant is fixed. So first you want the water to be meeting all requirements. We've got our lead and galvanized pipe. Right now we are on a path, hopefully, to get all those lead pipes out by there's some estimates that they could all be out by fall, so that's great. When we get to a place where we have all copper lines, but then we'll still have those sources of lead in the household plumbing and faucets, fixtures, valves, and lead solder. So it will still be important to use filters at that time to make sure that any lead that's in the household plumbing is coming out of the water.
Come on.
So that is kind of my conclusion of my water quality part here.
Thank you.
All right.
Anyone have any questions that they'd like